It's mid-morning on a sea day. The pool deck is busy, the coffee's still hot, and somewhere in the background, the PA system crackles to life. The captain's voice. Not the usual noon announcement. A major seismic event has been recorded. Authorities have issued a tsunami advisory for several coastal areas along your route. The ship is changing course, and the direction he names is not toward the nearest port. What happens next is nothing like what the movies prepared you for. The physics nobody explains. Most people's mental image of a tsunami involves a wall of water the height of a building, rolling toward a ship and swallowing it whole. Now that image comes from disaster films, and it's almost completely wrong when it comes to what a tsunami actually looks like in open ocean. A tsunami is not a conventional wave. It's a pulse of energy moving through the entire water column from the sea floor to the surface. That energy is generated most often by a seafloor earthquake, displacing millions of tons of ocean floor. Though submarine landslides and volcanic collapses can do the same thing. Once set in motion, the energy spreads outward in all directions at roughly 500 to 800 kilometers per hour, depending on how deep the water is. Now that's comparable to a commercial airliner at cruising speed. But here's the part that almost never gets explained clearly. In deep water, that enormous energy is distributed across an equally enormous volume. The wave height in open ocean can be less than half a meter. The distance from one crest to the next, what oceanographers call the wavelength, can run to several hundred kilometers. If you were standing on the bridge of a cruise ship in the open Pacific when a tsunami passed under the hull, you might feel nothing at all. The bow lifts almost imperceptibly, settles back down, and the ocean surface looks exactly as it did before. Everything changes when that energy reaches shallow water. As the wavefront moves toward a coastline and the sea floor begins to rise, the bottom of the wave starts dragging. The wave slows down, but the mass of water behind it is still traveling at speed. The energy compresses into a smaller and smaller volume. The wave height increases, sometimes by a factor of 10 or more compared to what it was in open ocean. The wavelength shortens. Currents around the wave become chaotic and violent. What passed beneath a ship at sea without any drama can arrive at a beach as a wall of moving water that strips buildings from their foundations. That is the physical reality behind every tsunami warning. And once you understand it, a lot of what cruise ships actually do during these events starts to make complete sense. The ship in open ocean. If a cruise ship is well offshore and in deep water when a tsunami warning is issued, that is likely the safest place to be. The wave will pass beneath it. The motion will be minimal to non-existent. The bridge team will be running a full monitoring operation behind the scenes, staying in contact with marine authorities, tracking the event through official channels, and watching depth data as they hold or adjust position. But the passengers walking the promenade deck may have no idea anything has happened. What passengers do experience is the secondary effect. The itinerary changes. Any port that sits within the advisory zone gets canceled or delayed without negotiation. The ship holds position at sea rather than approaching the coastline. Depending on the scale of the event, the hold can last hours or stretch overnight. The dining schedule stays intact. The shows still run, but the destination has disappeared from the board. That holding pattern is not excessive caution. It reflects something important about the way tsunamis actually behave in time. They do not arrive as a single wave and then withdraw. They arrive in a series of surges, each separated by minutes or sometimes over an hour. The first surge is not necessarily the most powerful. In several well-documented events, the third or fourth stage was larger than the first. A harbor that looked passable after the initial arrival can be hit again harder 20 minutes later. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake off the coast of Japan produced a tsunami that traveled across the entire Pacific and still carried enough energy to cause real damage when it reached Crescent City Harbor in Northern California, more than 8,000 kilometers from the source. The damage there was not from a single catastrophic wave. It came from the repeated surge and drainage of the harbor over several hours. Boats torn from moorings, dock infrastructure broken up, vessels thrown against each other. Ships that were already out at sea experienced nothing. That contrast is not an accident. It's the physics at work. And the bridge team on a cruise ship in open water knows this. Holding offshore is not paralysis. It's the correct operational response. The ship docked in port. Now, a cruise ship tied up at the berth is a different situation entirely, and considerably more complicated to manage. When a large ship is docked, it's not simply floating near a wall. It's attached to that wall by heavy mooring lines under constant tension, with fenders between the hull and the dock absorbing movement of the sea. The ship is also sitting in a defined basin of water with fixed infrastructure on multiple sides. When a tsunami surge enters that basin, the behavior of the water changes completely from what happens in open sea. The surge does not just raise the water level uniformly, it drives current through the harbor in one direction. Then the withdrawal pulls it back in the opposite direction, often with equal or greater force. Those current reversals happen repeatedly, and each one puts stress on the mooring lines, the dock fittings, and the hull. If the warning comes early enough and the ship can get out before the first surge arrives, the call is usually to cast off and move to deep water. But that's not a quick operation. A cruise ship of 100,000 tons or more requires a coordinated departure. The engines need to be at operational readiness. The navigation team needs to be fully staffed on the bridge. The harbor pilot may need to be on board, and the ship needs to confirm whether any passengers are still ashore. Getting every one of those elements in order takes time, sometimes more time than the warning window allows. If the ship cannot depart safely, it stays, and the crew shifts focus to securing the vessel as well as possible within the constraints of the berth, preparing for the surge and protecting the hull from impact with dock structures. External decks are closed. Any guests still ashore are recalled via every available communication channel. Shore excursions that were underway are canceled mid-trip. For passengers on board, this transition feels abrupt and confusing because the crew will not spend time on detailed public explanations while they're actively managing the situation. The practical outcome for passengers is disruption. A port day disappears. Plans go to nothing. The ship may be delayed in port for much longer than expected, or it may leave earlier than expected with no ability to wait for stragglers. Neither outcome is comfortable, but both are managed responses to a real operational threat, not overreaction. The danger in a harbor during a tsunami event is well established, and it is not theatrical. The ship near shore, not yet docked. This is the scenario with the most variables and the one that requires the sharpest decision-making from the bridge. A ship at anchor offshore, or midway through a tender operation, sits in a position where depth matters more than almost anything else. The distance from the shoreline is far less relevant than how deep the water is at the current position. A ship anchored 2 kilometers from a beach can be in 40 meters of water. Another anchored 5 kilometers out can be in 20 meters, depending on how the seabed shelves. In shallow waters, even a modest tsunami surge can create dangerous conditions around the hull and unpredictable behavior with the anchor chain. The standard response is to weigh anchor, halt all tender operations, and move to deeper water. Recalling all tenders sounds straightforward, but it requires knowing exactly where each tender boat is, how many passengers are aboard, and whether the conditions will allow a safe return to the ship. If the timeline is tight and the sea state is changing, the captain may have to make a decision that leaves some passengers temporarily ashore under the care of local authorities and port agents, with the ship repositioning for safety and returning to collect them once the situation allows. It's also worth addressing a persistent misconception here. Films often show ships at high speed racing away from an incoming wave. That's not how this works in practice. A tsunami's energy is already in the water column beneath the ship the moment a warning is issued. There's no wave visible on the horizon that the ship can race away from. The ship cannot outrun something traveling at 600 kilometers per hour. What the ship can do is reposition itself into deeper water, which changes how that energy behaves when it passes through. That is a meaningful and important move. It's just not a chase scene. The ship in a fjord or narrow inlet. Of all the positions a large ship can occupy when a tsunami warning is issued, a confined fjord or narrow inlet is the most hazardous. And this is not a marginal difference. It's a categorically different risk environment. The geometry of a fjord does something to water movement that open coastlines do not. When a surge enters a wide, open bay, the energy is spread across a broad area, and the effects are distributed. When the same surge enters a narrow channel flanked by steep rock walls, that energy is concentrated. The water cannot spread laterally, so it rises and it accelerates. Current velocities inside a narrow inlet during a tsunami event can reach levels that make ship handling extremely difficult, even for experienced officers, and the rate of water level change can be rapid and unpredictable. Alaska is the most relevant context for cruise passengers thinking about this risk. The state's coastline carries some of the heaviest scenic cruise traffic in the world, routing ships through spectacular but confined waterways that run through one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The combination of narrow geography, nearby earthquake faults, and unstable terrain on the surrounding slopes creates a risk profile that simply does not exist on a mid-ocean crossing. Latakia Bay in southeast Alaska is sometimes cited in discussions about tsunami risk, and it deserves an accurate explanation rather than a dramatic one. In 1958, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake triggered a massive rockfall into the bay that generated a wave with a run-up height of over 500 meters, the highest ever recorded. That event was caused by a local landslide directly into an enclosed bay, not by a distant offshore earthquake sending a wave across the ocean. The dynamics were different. The scale was an extreme outlier, and it should not be used as a model for what a Pacific-wide tsunami warning would produce in Alaskan waters. What it does illustrate, accurately, is the category of terrain-driven wave risk that exists in confined Alaskan waterways, and that has no equivalent in open sea routes. When a warning is issued and a ship is in a fjord, the priority is straightforward: exit to open water. This is easier said than done in some fjords where the channel is long and the ship cannot simply turn around, which is why cruise operators routing through these environments maintain detailed contingency plans for exactly this scenario. The itinerary is scenic. The risk management behind it is not casual. What passengers actually experience. Set aside the disaster film version for a moment. Here's what a tsunami warning actually looks like and feels like on a well-managed cruise ship. You hear the PA. The captain speaks. The language is measured and factual. A seismic event has occurred. An advisory has been issued. The ship is taking precautionary action. You're asked to stay clear of external decks, remain in public areas or your cabin, and await further announcements. There's no alarm klaxon and there's no controlled panic. The staff you see in the corridors look calm, which some passengers find unsettling rather than reassuring, because calm is not what the movies taught them to expect. The crew's composure is genuine and it's professional. These events are part of maritime safety training. Officers on the bridge are trained in tsunami response procedures. What the calm appearance does not communicate is the level of activity happening out of passenger sight. The bridge running constant position checks and depth assessments. The hotel director coordinating with department heads to ensure guests are accounted for and shore parties recalled. The communications team in contact with port agents and maritime rescue coordination centers across multiple time zones. From a passenger's perspective, the tangible effects are shore excursions canceled without the option to appeal, deck areas restricted or closed entirely, possible announcement of itinerary changes, and if the ship is at sea, The experience of waiting in open water for many hours with no visible reason to be there. The food service continues. The entertainment schedule may be adjusted, but the day takes on a different texture. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami offers the clearest historical illustration of why the ship's position matters so much. The event killed over 200,000 people, almost all of them on shore or in shallow coastal waters. Vessels at sea in the region when the waves arrived experienced unusual motion in some cases, but the casualties and the destruction were concentrated entirely in the shallow water zones, on beaches and in harbors and across coastal communities that absorbed the full transferred energy. Larger vessels in deeper water offshore were not part of that death toll. The physics that explains this is the same physics that was described at the start, and it holds. The danger does not end when the wave does. One of the most consistent mistakes people make when thinking about tsunami events is assuming the risk ends when the primary wave is over. News coverage reinforces this. Once the initial impact has been reported and the dramatic footage is circulating, attention moves on. But the physical reality at the coast, and particularly inside harbors, is still evolving. Harbor currents after a major tsunami can remain erratic and dangerous for 12 hours or more. The initial surge moves in, the drawback pulls the water out, and the cycle continues with each successive wave in the series. The interval between surges means there are apparent lulls that can look like a return to normal conditions when they are not. Submerged debris from damaged infrastructure creates invisible hazards. Water depth readings in affected harbors change because the sedimentation shifts and dock structures may have partially collapsed. Port authorities cannot issue vessel clearances until physical assessments have been completed, and those assessments take time. A cruise ship holding offshore after a tsunami warning is not waiting for the all clear on television. It's waiting for an official clearance from the port authority based on a physical survey of the harbor. That distinction matters because the two things do not happen at the same time. The TV coverage can declare an event over hours before any reasonable harbor master would sign off on vessel entry. For passengers, the implication is a timeline that feels disproportionate to what they can see. The sea around the ship looks fine. The sky is clear. The coast in the distance looks normal. And the ship is still sitting offshore, not going anywhere, possibly until the following morning. Now that's not the captain being unreasonably cautious. That is the captain working within a clearance system that exists because re-entering a harbor too early has caused real damage to real ships, and the protocol reflects those lessons. Missed port calls in this context are genuinely treated under force majeure clauses in cruise contracts, meaning the line is not liable for compensation in the way it would be for a mechanical cancellation. Now, whether that feels fair depends on your perspective, but the decision itself is not discretionary. Once a tsunami advisory is active and a harbor authority has not issued clearance, the ship does not enter. That line is not negotiable at any level of the company. The real picture. Pull back to the wider view. A cruise ship in deep ocean during a tsunami event is not the vulnerable object the disaster imagination conjures. It's a platform that the physics of the ocean are, in that moment, working to protect. The energy beneath it has nowhere to concentrate, nothing to compress against, no shallowing seafloor to force it upward. The ship rides over it and moves on. The real danger is coastal. It lives in the confined harbor, in the mooring line straining against reversing currents, in the shallow anchorage where wave behavior is unpredictable, in the narrow fjords where geography turns a modest surge into a violent channel event. It lives in the gap between the first surge and the fifth, and in the temptation to treat the quiet between them as the end of the event rather than a pause. Cruise captains do not outrun tsunamis. They do not stand on the bridge pointing into a wall of water. What they do is read position, read depth, read the clock, and move the ship to the place where the physics is working in their favor. Sometimes that means departing a port in a hurry. Sometimes it means sitting offshore for a day. Sometimes it means a changed itinerary and a lot of unhappy passengers who were looking forward to that port. But the logic behind every one of those decisions is the same: open water, deep water, and enough time between the warning and the coastline. That is the calculation. And understanding it makes a routine-seeming captain's announcement feel like exactly what it is: a professional making the right call, calmly, under real pressure. Now, if this gave you a clearer picture of how cruise operations actually work, subscribe for more. We cover the side of cruising that brochures skip. The next video is already up, and remember, your voyage is just beginning.